Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Jackson Center. My name is Kristen McMahon and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. Welcome to all of you in person and online for our educational seminar, Cold War Secrets Revealed. We appreciate you spending the time with us today. Before I begin introductions, I'd like to thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsor, Lakeshore Savings, our gold sponsors, Chautauqua Abstract Company, the County of Chautauqua Industrial Development Agency, the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, and the Jamestown Bar Association. Our bronze level supporters, the Al and Marge Brown Endowment Fund at CRCF and Hall and Lee Yaw LLP, and our in-kind support, Chautauqua Harbor Hotel. So thank you to all of our sponsors for helping us with what is our first in-person event in 18 months. So we are thrilled to have both an in-person audience as well as our online audience. So 3 weeks ago, I had the privilege of being in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, to commemorate the conclusion of the 75th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal on the dates the verdicts were read, September 30th and October 1st. To walk in Justice Jackson's footsteps is an experience I shall not forget. And as he said, the Nuremberg trial of the major Nazi war criminals was an attempt to answer in terms of the law the most serious challenges that faces modern civilization, war and international lawlessness. Its value to the world will depend less on how faithfully it interpreted the past than how accurately it forecasts the future. And the Cold War mentality and all of its activities and non-activities were born out of these roots. Twice in Jackson's lifetime, the world was involved in major conflicts, and it was leery of what the next major conflict might bring. As Jackson also said, and he has a quote for everything, "Our common task is to enable each of our countries to realize the common aspiration of all of our peoples for freedom under law. These professional interests bridge our differences of nationality, language, and legal philosophy." And so part of what you will hear today are behind-the-scenes stories from the Cold War era, and we are excited to share our panelists' research and stories with you today. I'm going to first introduce our moderator, Mr. Gregory L. Peterson, who will work with Professor Downey, Ms. Greenspan, Mr. Rosenbaum, and Consul General Gill to share their stories with you. He is of counsel at Phillips Lytle LLP. Mr. Peterson has received numerous honors and awards and is listed in the best lawyers in America. He is an honoree of the New York State Bar Association Empire State Counsel Program for pro bono work for the years 2011 to 2018, and again in 2020. He is a member of the Jamestown Bar, the New York State Bar, the Northern Chautauqua Bar, the Pennsylvania Bar, and the American Bar Associations. He received his BA from Allegheny College and his JD from the Dickinson School of Law of the Pennsylvania State University. He is the Jackson Center co-founder, a past president, and a former board chair. Please welcome Gregory Peterson to his chair. I am going to introduce both of our morning speakers since we do not have a break between the two of them. So, first up is Professor Arthur T. Downey, a lawyer, diplomat, government official, and the author of The Cold War, Law, Lawyers, Spies, and Crises, a thorough look at the people and doctrines that helped avoid global catastrophe. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to East German uprisings, McCarthyism to loyalty oaths, Professor Downey is the former director of the Bureau of East-West Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce. He is a former State Department lawyer who served on the National Security Council staff under Henry Kissinger. He graduated from St. Vincent College, where he earned his BA in history. He continued his education at Villanova University, law school, where he earned his JD before going on to receive an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center, where he also serves as an adjunct professor. We're very excited to have you with us today, Professor Downey.
Oh, this is terrific. Live. We haven't done this in almost 2 years.
Wow.
And we, for 20 years of the Jackson Center, have made this part of our grist, is to have these opportunities to meet distinguished people like you.
If you can't get them, then I can come.
No, Arthur, this is great. Now, I always enjoy the fact, and how does this happen? How do we get access to an Arthur Downey who would be such a hotshot to write a book like this, and among other things? And it really came through Jamestown, New York, a relationship with Chuck Gustafson. Chuck Gustafson is a lawyer. He's also a professor at Georgetown. He knows well Arthur Downey, and his lovely wife is here to join us. Thank you very much. And through that, he said, Greg, if you're ever going to do a program, check in with Art Downey. He's the best. He's done a variety of things, dealing with Civil War lawyers, dealing with Cold War lawyers, the Creole affair, a variety of things which you've done. And then he introduced me to you. We talked on the phone, and you teased me terrifically. Yeah, you did. And how did that happen? Because one of the things in his biography is the fact that he, aside from having lived through the Cold War, and many aspects, he actually was assigned in the State Department to Berlin. And as a result of being in Berlin, he had an opportunity to actually meet somebody that is on our wall and over there and virtually every place. And I've never met a guy who was 1 degree of separation. So that alone gets you an invite, and here you accept it, and here you are. So I won't tease you out anymore, but Rudolf Hess. We're going to start with that, because give a little background on how you met Rudolf Hess, because I think then we can launch from there.
I didn't really meet Rudolf Hess. I met number 7. Because he, when the Nuremberg prisoners got off the truck in Berlin to be housed in Spandau prison, they were given numbers in the order that they got off the truck. Rudolf Hess happened to be the last one, the last of 7 off the truck, and he was known officially as number 7. Part of that was a cruel, I think, effort to demean the humanity of somebody. You're not a name anymore, you're a number. You don't count. But he was number 7, so I never knew him as Mr. Hess. It was number 7. But I was assigned to Berlin in the late 60s. And one of my responsibilities at that time was to be the senior operating representative for Spandau prison, where he was located. At that point, he was the sole prisoner. The others had died or were freed. So it was kind of unusual. And the prison was guarded by each of the 4 powers on a monthly rotating system, so that 1 month the Soviets would be responsible for the military security of the prison. And this, by the way, is the only prison, I think, in the world where the purpose of the guards is not to prevent prisoners from leaving, but to prevent people from outside coming in. That's what they were worried about, some neo-Nazis coming in trying to free them. So each of the 4 countries would have a military detachment responsible for the external security of the prison. And that system changed every month, so that every 4 months, the Americans or the British or the French or the Soviets would be responsible. In that process, the responsible country would host a luncheon, and I gave to Greg the menu that was served at the luncheon. It's kind of neat because it's got the flags of the 4 countries. And needless to say, everybody wanted to come for French month. Many wanted to come for Soviet month because there was caviar and lots of vodka. There was also a good turnout for American month because we had steaks set in and California wine. The British month was never overbooked.
So you had a reason, though, to act. There was a reason to actually talk to number 7, because there was concern about, him, just being active and things like that. And what's that story?
We, as part of the monthly assumption of command, we would go and meet with prisoner 7.
Can you please move the microphone closer?
Yes, without knocking it over. Is that better? Can you hear better? Thank you very much. We would meet with number 7 just to be sure he was still there. And the conditions were stark. He was in a stone cell, iron bars, and it was really tough living for any human. We were concerned that he seemed to be losing speed, as it were. And we felt that it was our obligation. He's our prisoner, and we have to keep him healthy. This is a clear international law responsibility for us. And so we thought it would be good to get him outside in the sun to keep him healthy. And we mentioned that to the Soviets, and they said, "Niet, no, we're not going to do that." So my French and British colleague and I worked with them, with the Soviets, and said, "Look, what if he's working? What if he's out in the yard working and he's raking leaves or something?" Well, okay, maybe that took a long time to negotiate. And we presented that to number 7. And the bastard put his nose in the air and said, "I am a minister of the Reich. Ministers of the Reich do not engage in manual labor." No. So we had to go back to the Soviets and tell them, sorry, that's not going to work. We said, all you have to do is hold the hose or stand there with a rake to be in the sun instead of in this dank stone iron prison. Yeah, no.
This book that you have written that we're talking about today, dealing with the Cold War, has been reviewed very favorably. Among those is David Atchison, a United States Attorney for District of Columbia, who says Arthur T. Downey has performed a valuable service by putting in a single volume a smooth, readable, even entertaining history of the legal and constitutional issues produced by the Cold War and their resolution.
And his father, of course, is David Atchison.
Yes. Dropping names, yeah. I like this. And then on top of it, towards the sum up, you talk about various lawyers of this book, and you also talk about a young lawyer serving as legal advisor to the United States Mission in Berlin, who learned a good deal of history during his regular meetings with Hitler's one-time deputy Rudolf Hess in Spandau Prison. What caused you to write this book?
I had written a book on the Civil War a few years before that. And it was about Civil War lawyers, because I learned at that time everybody in America who was anybody was a lawyer. All of Lincoln's cabinet were lawyers. All of Jefferson Davis's cabinet were lawyers, except for Davis. He was a West Pointer. And lawyers ran the show. They dominated Congress and everything else because in those days, or before then, back in England, any aspiring young man, his path of advancement was either in the ministry or in the military. We didn't have an established church, so the ministry was not an appropriate path. We didn't have a standing army. And so the path for a promising young man was the law. He didn't have to go to law school, could just read law a bit. And so they dominated. I mean, overwhelmingly, Congress was composed of lawyers. Not today. Most people think, damn, lawyers run Congress too, but they don't. They're way less than half. So I wrote that book, and the publisher, it was on the Civil War and lawyers, Civil War lawyers. And the publisher came back and said, we've been so pleased with the reception for the book, we've decided to do a series of books on war and the law. Will you do the series? And I said, no, I don't want to do a series of books. And they said, how about just one book, one law? And I said, which war? They said, any war you want, pick one. And I said, well, I lived through the Cold War. How about that? They said, okay. So that's how I did it, why I did it.
You know, it is interesting when you talk about lawyers who played a role during the Cold War, just to drop names, that you cover, like Dean Acheson, James Baker, George Ball, William Casey, Fidel Castro, Clark Clifford, Gerald Ford, John Foster Dulles, James Donovan, who is a subject. And by the way, I know watching this is Anthony Palermo. Anthony Palermo was the second seat prosecutor of Colonel Rudolph Abel, which is a chapter in your book. And so, Anthony, wherever you are, I just wanted to reach out. But James Donovan represented Colonel Abel. Gorbachev, J.W. Fulbright, Elger Hiss, Henry Jackson, Richard Nixon, Joseph McCarthy, Robert Kennedy. These are names which goes on of people who were players during that Cold War and are lawyers.
Yeah.
And do you think that's just coincidence, or the fact that lawyers at the time, certainly during this time frame, were more likely to be in positions of political power and political decision-making?
Yes, I think it's that, Greg. I think we were still transitioning from the Civil War period to the current period, where lawyers are now less visible, less involved than they were at that time.
Is there a
And excuse me, and so much of what we were talking about during the Cold War, which if the Cold War had a physical center, it was Berlin. And our rights to be in Berlin and the obligations of the Soviets with respect to Berlin, we had this deep overlay of law that was really very prominent. That was the dominant thing. So it made sense that legal issues in the law would be involved, and that draws in lawyers.
As at the time, we would kind of tie in the Nuremberg trial. We're on our 75th anniversary here, and during that time period, there was the Control Council created among the four allies, which divided up Germany, but also divided up Berlin.
Yeah, into four sectors.
Yeah.
And the Spandau prison was in the British sector of Berlin, and it was just so important for the Soviets. Every Soviet at that time would quote Lenin quoting Marx, that whoever possesses Berlin controls Germany, and whoever controls Germany controls Europe. And so that was central for their whole view of things.
And you were part of that, really being assigned by the U.S. State Department there as the Control Council. I mean, you were a player in there.
Yeah, it was most interesting period.
How did it work?
Well, the Soviets were out of it. The Soviets left four-power control, except for the Berlin Air Safety Zone Center, which was a position in Berlin where each of the four powers had a representative, usually an Air Force colonel, to control the three air corridors coming into Berlin. And the only other continuing four-power operation was Spandau Prison, where we would all meet. So those were the two not heretics. What's the word? Hereditary, right, of the original four-power agreement.
If you go on YouTube at some point, you'll see the marching in and the marching out of the soldiers that once a month, it's kind of one-upsmanship and on both everybody's army.
And it was really very powerful. I would always attend the transfer of control sessions out in the yard of the prison. It's a very large area. And as it happened, we and the Soviet troops would hand off to each other. That is, the end of the Soviet month would be the beginning of the American month to guard the prison along the walls. And they would stand out in the courtyard. And we would always get the biggest guys we could get. Most of them had fought in Vietnam. They were battle tested, and they just looked mean as could be. And the Soviets, of course, did the same thing. They got their biggest guys, and they were lined up facing each other. And each of the two commanders would make a formal statement in English and in Russian to each other. In the name of the President of the United States, I hereby transfer the responsibility for the control and protection of Spandau prison to you, Colonel so-and-so. And then the Soviet guy, the Russian, would say the same thing back, I accept this. And then two of them would go off to each of the guard posts around the perimeter. An incredibly stirring event.
Yeah.
Nothing has ever approached that for me.
Well, it was interesting when you think of the pomp and circumstance concerning it for the benefit of one person.
Yeah, over there.
You know, so all of you.
And he eventually died, killed himself at the prison.
Yeah. We've used the term Cold War. When did it begin?
The Cold War, or the term?
Yeah.
The term began probably in 1947. I think Walter Lippmann, the columnist, wrote a book called The Cold War. The beginning of the Cold War, I think, can be dated in several ways. Maybe the first is 1946. That's when Winston Churchill traveled by train with Harry Truman to Fulton, Missouri, and gave a speech which was titled The Sinews of Peace, but it was in that speech that he said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across Europe. So many people will say that's the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviets, by the way, in Nuremberg, read that speech and were kind of perplexed. They said, hey, we've been working here as allies, here in Spandau, we're all buddies, go out drinking together. And Churchill says, now we're enemies. How do we deal with this? It was hard. So anyway, so some people would say it began in 1946 with the Churchill speech. Others would say, no, it began in 47, 48 with the development of what was called the Truman Doctrine, which was to actively intervene in Turkey and in Greece to prevent communist takeovers, with the General Marshall's, Secretary of State Marshall's commencement address at Harvard, where he proposed the Marshall Plan. Others would say it began in 1949 with the creation of NATO, which demonstrated that those countries were quite concerned about the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. The original goal of NATO was to keep the Soviets out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. They were not members, of course. They were still occupied. So many would say that was the beginning of the Cold War.
George Kennan, who was the ambassador to Russia, and you spent quite a bit of time on the book about Kennan and his memo to the president about how to react to the Russians and the concept of containment. Can you talk about that?
And he wrote what was called the long letter which if you go to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, is prominently displayed, where he proposed the containment of the Soviet Union. That's the way to do it. And then he wrote a long article in Foreign Affairs magazine at that time, and that became the rallying cry for the Truman administration's dealing with the Soviets. Very famous, highly influential, extraordinary man.
Obviously, part and parcel of this is a fear factor, and curious about your own personal experience. I know my own during the Cold War, when you first personally kind of realized that there was this big bad bear in Russia and we should fear it.
I don't think there was a moment of enlightenment. I think it was part of the culture. You know, once they exploded the nuclear bomb, and once Eastern Europe was scarfed up, I think it was in the lifeblood of the United States at that point. So it wasn't, I had some epiphany that, oh, I'm scared of these guys. And I traveled a lot through Eastern Europe and later through the Soviet Union. I had clients in some of those countries too, so I would travel there. My wife and I and two of our college-age kids, drove through East Germany and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, about 6 months before the wall came down. My two kids always suspected that I knew the wall was coming down, and I wanted them to see what it was like before the wall, and I have not disabused them of that. I really knew what was happening. But that was really a fascinating period to see how things were changing. The Hungarians basically lifted border controls. So any Hungarian, sort of a recreation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungarians could move through the border between Hungary and Austria. Well, as soon as that border was opened, it was clogged all the time, but Poles and East Germans and everybody would go to Hungary so they could come out to Vienna through the Hungarian border, which was opened. And fortunately, Gorbachev had released the doctrine that permitted the Soviets to intervene in any country which was getting slack. Yeah.
Cold War time period, the 40s, the 50s, the Berlin airlift. I mean, there was a whole lot of posturing going on at that time. Do you think that was proactive or reactive? You know,
the real posturing, if you're talking about posturing, was how that location, Berlin, the wall, was a forum for our presidents. I mean, we all remember Ich bin ein Berliner, John F. Kennedy, at the Brandenburg Gate. I knew the woman who was his German teacher to get him ready for that speech. And she told me that he was just awful with language. I mean, a brilliant guy, but awful with language. And his original text was supposed to be a page long, and he just couldn't get through it. It would come out all garbled. Then it got down to be a paragraph, and then it ended up with just this phrase, Ich bin ein Berliner. And Kennedy used it, and then Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. Reagan used it. It's been a great theater stage for American presidents.
And with regards on the other side, during the 1947, 48 time period, when the requirement of the Berlin airlift, and ultimately it was the Stalin thinking that Berlin was his, and Berlin, of course, it was landlocked. I mean, there was no way to get from West Germany to Berlin except through a corridor.
It's 110 miles into the German Democratic Republic, as it became known.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that time period, again, I just, the nuclear equality, if you will, and Nancy will be talking about that in a great deal as the source of that equality of the arms race, which ultimately kept everything at bay. And my fear factor, I'm 70, when you're under the desks and you're, a whole lot of things going on, and certainly with the Bay of Pigs, I mean, that is just so emblazoned in my mind as to the fear that you had watching this on TV.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis,
yeah. Which
followed that. And so the whole sum total of that. And from your perspective, as you're writing this, it's hard to glaze whether this was, again, it's posturing, who's going to muscle out who's going to blink first. Do you get a sense of all that?
Yeah, it's really quite amazing how exactly as you say, the blinking part, and how close we came so often to real disasters, certainly during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the other time was in 1983, I think, when there was going to be a NATO exercise to simulate a nuclear exchange. And the Soviets, for years, had been tasking the KGB to come up with measuring sticks that we can figure out before NATO might launch a first strike. What are the signals we might be able to figure out? And the results of the KGB study was, well, watch out for massively increased communications between Washington and London. That'll be the signal that something's going on, and you better be careful. So in '83, all of a sudden, there's a massive surge of communications between Washington and London. And the Soviets said, oh my God, it's starting. And they had some word that there was an attack coming. And it was so serious that they loaded, with nuclear weapons, they loaded aircraft, MiGs, in East Germany, ready to take off. And it turned out, of course, the United States had just invaded Grenada, a British colony. And so the communications between Washington and London were massive because the Queen was unhappy. The United States had just gone into her turf. And so we came within a hair of a serious mess.
Well, as you're researching this book, uncovering that aspect of it, I'm not sure many people appreciated that aspect and how such a tipping point we were at, And were there other kind of surprises as you lived it, you saw, you were kind of part of it, you were on the inside and on the outside of it all, but you said, I had no idea this was all happening. Was there a chapter that was so surprised to you?
Well, maybe the one funny one is in 1971. I was on the NSC staff at that time, and it was all over the news that Kissinger was in Pakistan, and he had been meeting with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and he got sick. Kissinger did. And the Prime Minister, the news reports were the Prime Minister opened up his country estate for Kissinger to go and get well, but the word was he wasn't going to be talking to the press for a couple of days. And then the next thing we knew, in fact, Kissinger wasn't sick. He was on a Pakistani airline with a Chinese co-pilot flying to Beijing to meet with Zhou Enlai to work out the famous Mao-Nixon visit the next year. And this was the huge secret, and it was kept secret from me. And I didn't even know that. It was quite amazing how that was, and that was a very important point, the Nixon opening to China, because the Soviet-Chinese relationship was always a bit wobbly. They shared a 2,500-mile border, which was tense at times. The Soviets would play up to India every once in a while just to stick it in the nose of the Chinese, their enemy. So that was a very interesting period, very secret and surprising period.
Your boss for a period of time was Henry Kissinger.
Right.
Did you have any interaction with him?
Oh, sure, all the time.
Well, let's talk about Henry Kissinger. It's that we haven't ever talked about him. And it's still alive, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
What was your sense of him then and perhaps in reflection now?
Oh, I don't think it's changed. He's extraordinarily brilliant, demanding. For example, when I first went there to the NSC staff, he asked me to do a memo on something, and I did it, sent it over, and it came back right away the next day with a little scroll at the top, "Are you sure?" So I redid it, sent it back, and 2 days later it came back with another one, "Is this the best you can do?" I said, "Oh my God." So I stayed up night and day, redid it, and I gave it to him, and he said, "All right, now I'll read it." So that was his way of making sure people were pushing to try to do the best you can all the time. And so he was a hard taskmaster and a master at keeping secret. I mean, that trip to Pakistan and then to Beijing was extraordinary. I mean, he kept it secret from the Secretary of State, from everybody except the president. And that was a huge, clever move.
Is that how he ran his office? Sort of like, I'm envisioning as you're talking about that, sort of like he used Hitler's, Führerprinzip, where he had these silos. Essentially, nobody ultimately knew what everybody else was doing. It was just boom, boom, boom. Was that a?
There was a lot of that, and he would also push people against each other. My two colleagues were both Soviet experts, and he would play off the other. "Hey, Hal just said this, Bill. What do you think?" And don't tell Bill this, Hal, but so and so. But his goal was to drive his horses to get the best out of them.
Yeah.
And it was effective. And it's one of the problems I think we've had in recent years with the NSC is, starting, I think it was during the Obama administration, the NSC staff was 250 people, 235 people. When I was there, it was 32 of us. And when you're small enough, it functions better because you're talking to everybody else all the time. But when you're 200 people, it doesn't work. And you're getting too much in the weeds.
How'd you get the job?
I had a friend in Berlin when I was there, David Anderson, who later became our ambassador to Yugoslavia. And David's closest friend was Larry Eagleburger, who later became Secretary of State. And Larry had been at that point on the NSC staff, and he had a heart attack. I wonder why. So he was looking for a recommendation to Kissinger to add to, not exactly to replace him, but something like it. And he asked David if he'd like it, and for reasons that escaped me, David said no. But he recommended me. That's how I got there.
Wow.
Just small world stuff. It's Washington small world.
Yeah. And you've been part of that. Not only as you wrote this book of the Cold War, you talked about the fact that you lived it, you were part of it, you were in the administration as part of that, and perhaps uniquely being able to write this kind of book. And it's really kind of American Bar Association lawyers' assistance, isn't it? I mean, part of a series of books on lawyers and wars and stuff like that?
Well, that's what they wanted me to do,
So, yeah.
but they never really did it in the end. There's not been another one like this.
Okay. So, was there as we've talked, we kind of jumped around a little bit chronologically, but Is there a point where you felt like the Cold War was heating up, hit the top point where it was really, is this the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis? Is this where we were really at our closest point?
Well, clearly, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then that 1982
right.
period. But after that, things changed. We as a world were so lucky to have the right people at the right time. I think we had Reagan beefing up the military, and sometimes he would get out of hand in charging with abusive language the Soviets. But still, at the bottom, who's got the nuclears, who's got the military strength was very important. And he beefed up our military so that the Soviets knew we were a serious threat. Mm-hmm. And then we were fortunate to have Bush, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, an extraordinary group. And on the Soviet side, of course, Gorbachev, who came at just the right time. We had this period in the Soviet Union when we had 4 chairmen of the Communist Party within 4 years. We had Andropov, Brezhnev, Chernenko, and then Gorbachev. There was kind of a leadership fatigue going on, just as we had a strong one. So we were very lucky to have good people in the right places. And of course, the people in Eastern Europe were just so extraordinary, like Walensa in Solidarity in Poland. And to have a Polish Pope at that time going to the Gdansk shipyard, that just filled people with hope. And in Czechoslovakia, the same thing, and in Hungary. So we were very fortunate to have the right people in the right place at the time that could lead to a decision to fix it all, end the occupation of Germany and so on.
You talk a lot about the interpersonal or the relationship and the names of the individuals of the Soviet side. Certainly Brezhnev was very much part of for an extended period of time. Mm-hmm. Was there an infrastructure underneath that where there was back channel conversations, groups that really were constantly communicating, which would then sort of set the stage and perhaps ratchet down the temperature?
There were lots of groups, unofficial, private groups that thought of themselves as being that conduit, that unofficial, give me the message and I'll pass it under the table when I'm in Moscow next. I saw some of that. I was involved for some years with the United Nations Association in New York that had what was called a parallel studies program with the Soviet counterparts. On the American side, our group was led by Brent Scowcroft and Governor Scranton. Before we would, and we would meet alternatingly in alternating years in Moscow or in New York. And beforehand, we would always go down to Washington. They would come down to Washington, meet with people in the government and say, no, we're going to be going to Moscow next week. What do you really want us to say? Yeah. But I think that was more show than anything else.
As you reflect back on the book, was there we've certainly seen Reagan tear down this wall, and there was, of course, Kennedy you talked about, but was there sort of an individual who maybe was able to set the stage for that which happened ultimately when the wall came down in the 1990, the Soviet Union sort of collapsed? Do you get a sense of a personality?
Well, of course, Gorbachev was a dominant personality here, the lawyer. And I think we're very fortunate to have someone like George Bush, H.W. Bush, in because he was a gentleman. He had been ambassador to China. He had been head of the CIA. He understood those kinds of workings. But he was, we could have blown it badly and said, we won the Cold War. You guys lost. He didn't gloat. And that was so important to have somebody of his stature taking that position that we both won, nobody lost, we were very fortunate. And fortunate to have Jim Baker as his Secretary of State, because they were tight as two tennis players, as I used to play tennis all the time. And on the Soviet side, Shevardnadze was the foreign minister for Gorbachev. But when a Secretary of State like a Baker spoke, everybody understood he was talking for the president. And that's important because so often that's not the case. And the other side is looking for some daylight between the Secretary of State and the president. And that never happened with us. Very important.
The book, The Cold War, in many senses, focuses in on Berlin during that time period. The Cold War generally comes to an end. Is Taiwan the new Cold War epicenter?
Well, to the extent that Berlin was the physical epicenter, this physical symbol of the Cold War, and I think it was. Clearly, Taiwan is today in a similar position in that everybody's focused on it. Everybody is looking for that to be the big problem. Earlier this year, I guess it was, Admiral Stavridis, the former NATO Supreme Commander, wrote a book called 2034, I think it was called. And it's a novel, but he poses a nuclear exchange between the United States and China a dozen years from now. You don't want to be in Galveston or in San Diego when the Chinese bombs are dropping, which is the two places in his novel he has the Chinese doing it. Yeah, it's the physical symbol. I don't think we're in a Cold War yet with China. We're in, I would prefer to call it a strategic rivalry. We haven't come to a Cold War, though we may, and it would be Taiwan that would do it. I regret that it's Taiwan. I would much rather be in the South China Sea. One of the other differences, of course, is that in the Soviet Cold War, the physical military threat was in an area of central Germany called the Fulda Gap. There's a gap in the hills and mountains, and NATO was prepared for hundreds of Warsaw Pact tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap toward Frankfurt and the Rhine River. And here, the conflict would be at sea. And remember, the Chinese Navy is larger than the American Navy right now. So it could be difficult. All the war games, reportedly, that the Pentagon and RAND have played show the United States losing a war with China. And I think it's also quite unlike the Berlin situation, the Cold War, where our rights, the Western rights to Berlin and all the affiliated, were clearly documented and unambiguous, and we could, as a nation, when Eisenhower went on television and spoke of our rights, we have a solid legal foundation. And with Taiwan, you have a country that says, this island is part of us. And at some point, that island might say, no, we are totally independent. But imagine during the Civil War, if the British said to the Confederacy, hey, we'll do a deal. We rely on your cotton exports to Britain for our mills. And if you give us a deal on that, we will recognize the Confederacy as a separate state, as a separate country. We'd be pretty angry at Great Britain. And this is complication. The situation with respect to Taiwan is not clear with respect to the mainland. It's vague, good arguments on all sides. So unlike the Cold War, there is a lack of total clarity, which is worrisome.
A book reviewer said, "The West won the Cold War in no small measure by adherence to our belief in the rule of law and the leadership of prominent American lawyers." Arthur Downey was on the front line of Cold War as the legal advisor to the U.S. mission in Berlin, has written this excellent and fascinating history of that effort. Some and substance of that dealt with the rule of law. You talked about it just a few minutes ago. What's the status of the rule of law on an international basis? We talked about here the 75th anniversary Nuremberg trial, and if there's anything we learned about last night as the fact of certainly in the German unification is the succession of the rule of law. Where are we today?
I think we've just been moving sideways. I don't think we've made any serious affirmative cohesion about the rule of law universally. We're just not grabbing it yet, and we haven't talked enough about it, I think. I mean, it may come up. There was a International Court of Justice decision about the South China Sea, for example, who owns what and so on. And that's good, although the Chinese have not accepted that decision. And with respect, if you're still talking about the Taiwan thing, there's a sort of a conflict there between the concept of territorial integrity, whose territory is Taiwan, and freedom of expression and self-determination. So you have the conflict between self-determination, the Taiwanese say we want to be separate and independent, and so on, and territorial integrity, mainland China saying we're one China and no separation. And that's a little fuzzy, as opposed to our rights to be in Berlin and so on. Although, yeah, enough.
If I were Chuck Gustafson, your good friend, and I were sitting here and Chuck had the final question to you, what might that be? Aside from the tennis game.
Chuck Gustafson grew up here in Jamestown, and is a friend of Greg's, a friend of mine. We were both young lawyers at the State Department together, and he was until this year, when he retired, he was a law professor at Georgetown Law School. And I just lost it there.
Well, if he had a question of you, he knows enough about you that I don't know. What would he be asking you, kind of that one zinger, that finale, that great conclusion question? It's hard. He would say, look, you've not said anything about the gaping hole that the Russians now claim that when we settled the German issue and recognized both Germanys, and both Germanys went into the UN, and then we put them together, and there's a single unified Germany. Part of that deal was we wouldn't add to NATO any of the Eastern European, and certainly not the former Soviet socialist republics like Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia as part of NATO. That would make perfect sense. And of course, the Russians say that all the time. You guys promised us that you would not move NATO eastward. And you have, because there are now 30 members of NATO. The last one last year, North Macedonia,
But you guys have put Lithuania and Latvia and Poland and Hungary and everybody's in NATO now, and you said you wouldn't do it. That's a tough one to deal with. I think the only way to deal with it is to say, that makes perfect sense, but if it was so important to you to get in exchange for giving up Germany and letting Germany be unified and in NATO, because they could have said, okay, we can unify Germany, but it can't be in NATO. But they yielded on that, and they yielded on everything. And so we must have given them in exchange this promise, we won't move NATO eastward, and we did. But I think the response is, if it's that important to you, Russians, Soviets, don't you think you would have written something down? Nobody has been able to find a document, a single piece of paper, where the West, where the Soviet, where the Americans, the Brits, or the French promised not to move NATO eastward. And you would have thought it would have been there. So I think that's the hardest thing, because it still rankles the Russians, of course. But if you're in Lithuania, you're very happy to be part of NATO. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because it'll come up a little bit later in our conversations with Consul General Gill. We talk about the Stasi and the Stasi's relationship with the KGB during that time in Berlin. And when all things fell apart, one of the KGB agents in Dresden was a guy named Vladimir Putin.
37-year-old guy.
Yeah.
And who, we've been in Dresden, and I've gone to the building that was the KGB headquarters there, and I can picture him standing out front with a pistol, as happened, as the East German mobs were coming toward it, and as he set the codes and the papers on fire in the backyard, standing there with his pistol, saying, "I've been instructed by Moscow to shoot anybody who tries to come on to this building." Yeah, just at the same time that a 35-year-old chemist from East Berlin went through the wall, looked in West Berlin and thought it was neat, but said she really had to get back to work at the chemistry factory. That, of course, was Angela Merkel. Amazing time.
And at the same time, a guy of a similar age named David Gill, who was the head of the East German resistance, was storming the Berlin Stasi building to preserve the records which were being destroyed. Yeah. And so that's a story to be told. Stay tuned.
Perfect timing.
The perfect timing is right. I don't know if that's selling a story or not, you know?
That's your creditors calling.
That's Chuck saying, saying good job. Well, what's the question I should have been asking you I haven't in conclusion? What's the one I've missed?
That you should have asked me? No, I think you would have been wonderful. You asked all the right questions. Ask the people in the audience if they have a question.
Actually, we're going to have a chance right during the break we're going to have the break between after Nancy speaks, and then we'll have a chance for everybody to have access to it downstairs. And then we'll go on to the second session. So, ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
Arthur Downey, thank you very much.
Thank you.